When looking over the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole, you'll see obvious changes as the eras progress of the game speeding up. Because of Yu-Gi-Oh's unique system compared to other popular games like Magic and Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't use rotating card pools, where cards are only legal for a set period of time. Instead, Yu-Gi-Oh! Operates on a ban list system, meaning that any card not on the list, no matter if it's 1 month old or 20 years old, is legal for tournament use. Because of this, the natural scale of power creep has been the primary driving factor in selling new products, as you wouldn't want to buy a product if the deck you were currently playing was superior in every way to the new stuff. A lot of these changes have been subtle, but others not so much, as this steady power creep has sped up the game significantly since the days of setting a monster and passing the turn. With this, a mechanic that's been in the game since its near inception, being cards you can activate on the opponent's turn from your hand, have slowly changed over the years to reflect the change in how the game's landscape as a whole has changed. These cards, known as hand traps in the community, have become intrinsically linked to the modern version of the game, as without them, players would have no way to prevent opponents from setting up completely unbreakable boards without interaction. Today we're going to go over how these effects have changed over the course of the game's history, how formats have shifted around these effects, and how both the meta landscape and hand traps have affected each other's designs. Let's take a look over the evolution of hand traps. The concept of hand traps began extremely early in the TCG with the release of Kuriboh and Metal Raiders back in 2002. The base idea presented was a way to prevent damage by discarding it, as most effect monsters of the time had extremely general effects as to not overshadow the big normal monsters of the time like Lajin and 7-colored fish. Kuriboh's effect was simple, yet provided utility in a diversity-lacking environment, though still rarely saw play due to the nature of the meta of the time essentially just being a race, which Kuriboh did not help to push an offensive game plan. From a period of about 2002 to 2007, no hand traps would be considered meta viable, as the game was in a much more simplified state at the time. The first hand trap to ever really see any play was DD Crow, released in Strike of Neos in 2007, and even then it was much more of a side deck option for countering out decks focused on the graveyard. Hand traps as a concept wouldn't really pick up until around 2008, when a couple of releases would slowly change how combat was handled in the meta. The first of these was Honest, released in Light of Destruction in mid-2008, a hand trap that could boost a light monster's attack by the attack of the other monster it's battling. This let any light monster clear an opposing monster in combat, making it an instant staple in light decks, which the only big one of the time was Lightsworn, which it fit into nicely with Dark Armed Dragon ruling the format. The other one was a promo card released alongside the Dark Legends reprint set in late 2008, being Gorz the Emissary of Darkness, a 2700 attack monster that can special summon itself when you take damage while controlling no cards. While this could trigger from effect damage, dealing the same amount back to the opponent, most commonly it would be used to respond to a direct attack, dropping a token with stats equal to the damage you took. This one card would change how players approached the battle phase entirely, as while it didn't promote deck building to counter, it made players usually attack with their lowest attack monster first when attacking directly, as that way, if the opponent had Gorz, they would have to either take all of the damage to drop it, or drop it in an inopportune moment to prevent damage. Many decks at the time would quickly add in Gorz, as with the previously stated Dark Armed Dragon around, the opponent clearing your board completely to make a lethal push was extremely common. Even after the eventual nerfing of Dad, Gorz remained a staple choice in deck building for the entire first half of 5Ds, as there weren't really any better options. There would be eventual releases to pair with Gorz, such as Tragodia as the Shonen Jump promo, which could be triggered off any battle damage, but was often considerably weaker, and Battle Fader from Absolute Power Force in early 2010, who stopped the battle phase entirely on a direct attack, but neither would be as widely used as Gorz had been. However, the main usage of hand traps as a combat tool was about to change as the 5Ds era began to wind down, as some began to shift away from being combat focused and more into true interruption. With the release of Duelist Revolution in mid-2010, the game was quickly shaken up by many of the releases here. Cards like Scrap Dragon, Pot of Duality, and Solemn Warning would all quickly become staples of the meta, but another card among these to reach staple status was Effect Veiler, a level 1 tuner that could be discarded from your hand during the opponent's main phase to negate a monster's effect on the field. This was one of the first true interruption hand traps outside of DD Crow, able to shut down a monster's effect before you could even start your first turn. This kind of interaction was a novel concept of the time and would inspire a few more like it within the 5Ds era, such as Droll and Lockbird and Starstrike Blast at the end of 2010, who was able to be discarded when the opponent added a card from deck to hand outside of their normal draw, locking them out of further adds for the rest of the turn. Droll was recognizably good, but the issue stemmed from the fact that on release, no deck searched so much to warrant this as a specific answer, although it would see side deck usage on and off when decks like Six Samurai came into prominence. The other major hand trap of the era, and by far and away the most contentious, was Max C, a TCG world premiere card that released in Storm of Ragnarok in early 2011. This one would let you discard it during either player's turn to draw a card every time the opponent special summoned that turn, which was particularly useful against the newly meta Six Samurais, as they tended to special summon a lot on their initial plays. Maxi would quickly find itself in most players' side decks and even some main decks, though at the time special summons were a bit more in check apart from a few exceptions, so it was not quite as useful out the gate as you would expect. However, the game would rapidly change as it progressed deeper into the Zexal era to be more and more focused on spamming out monsters as fast as possible through various strategies, leading to the insane popularity of Max C as time went on. With this rise, Max C found itself to be semi-limited in 2016, limited in 2017, and eventually outright banned in 2018, where it stays to this day. Notably, the card is actually fully unlimited in the OCG as of the writing of this video, though the ongoing debate seems to be whether or not Max C deserves to be at 0 or 3 in the TCG, using the OCG and Master Duel as comparison points. No other major improvements or releases would occur involving hand traps throughout the Zexal era, as the next major wave of hand traps would come in the Arc 5 era, which would go on to redefine what hand traps meant to the meta as a whole. Throughout the Arc 5 era, alongside the advent of pendulums, newer and stronger generic hand traps were added to the game that each had their own unique impact on how deck building developed. Starting in Duelist Alliance in mid-2014, Artifact Lancia was introduced as a member of the Artifact archetype to protect its members from being banished by tributing itself in the hand, but also served as an excellent counter to any strategy that needed to banish its cards to operate. While it wouldn't see immediate usage, Lancia would pick up as a popular option in later metas where decks that needed to banish to operate were prevalent. After this, the next big hand trap release was unquestionably Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, a level 3 tuner that could be discarded when a card on field activates its effect to destroy that card, but notably did not negate it. The primary usage for this at the time was to remove specific monsters from the board when they used their effects, or to counter out field spells and continuous spells and traps, as field spells and continuous spells and traps needed to remain on the field in order to resolve their effects. Ghost Ogre would see popularity as a counter for specific cards, but not too much play as it was more of a counter to specific lines. One of the more interesting uses for her was alongside Emergency Teleport in decks that were already playing it, like the eventual Cosmo, as it would allow you to summon the Ghost Ogre to field as a line of insulation. As for more unique hand traps, Psyframe Gear Gamma was released in High Speed Riders in late 2015 alongside the rest of the Psyframe archetype, but Gamma in particular was seen as useful in its ability to stop and destroy monster effects while also putting the materials on board for a level 8 Synchro. While it saw some play on release, it wouldn't see widespread usage until later metas, when it became much more important for stopping plays before setups occurred. Following in the footsteps of Ghost Ogre, the next of the new series of Ghost Girls was Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries, released in Shining Victories in mid-2016. This Ghost Girl would, if your opponent had more monsters than you, reveal a monster in your extra deck to banish all copies of that monster from the opponent's extra deck. While a solid effect, Ghost Reaper wouldn't reach nearly the same playability as her sister Ghost Ogre, being relegated to the side deck for mirror matches or specific meta calls. The same could not be said for the next Ghost Girl, even though she didn't fully match the naming scheme up until this point, being Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, released at the tail end of the Arc 5 era in Maximum Crisis in mid-2017. Ash Blossom's effect was widely considered to be the best of all of the Ghost Girls up until this point, able to stop any effects that searched a card, sent a card from deck to grave, or special summoned a monster from the deck, being a one-card answer to most of a deck's play lines. Ash Blossom would completely redefine deck building for a while after her release, as any deck that wanted to play in the meta had to either be able to play through Ash Blossom or have some kind of an answer for it, like Psyframe Gear Gamma, contributing to the card's popularity as a rising counterplay card. With the Ghost Girls redefining what hand traps could do in the meta landscape, especially with Ash Blossom, the fast approaching Vrain's era was shaping up to be a completely new landscape for the meta to grow from. Decently early into the Vrains era, in mid-2018, Flames of Destruction would be released, and with it not only new hand traps, but a way to actively counter out said hand traps. The first of these was the newest Ghost Girl, Ghost Belle in Haunted Mansion, which served as a counterpart to Ash Blossom as it affected any effect that would move a card from the grave. While not as meta-warping as Ash Blossom had been before it, Ghost Belle would see serious amounts of side deck play for countering out specific decks in the meta where grave-moving effects were prevalent. In a similar vein to these, the trap Infinite Impermanence was also released here, a trap that could be activated from your hand if you controlled no cards, providing a similar effect to Effect Veiler before it by negating a monster's effect on field, but could also be used to shut off any spell and traps activated in the same column if it was set before activating. While Imperm effectively did the same thing as Veiler, it was seen as a lot more flexible in that it could be used outside of the opponent's main phase and could also be used to shut off specific options from the opponent if set before activating, causing it to become a staple in many decks almost immediately. With the heavy rise in hand trap effects dominating deck building, there was eventually going to need to be some form of a counter option, which was also released here in Called by the Grave, a quick play spell that can banish any opponent's monster from the grave to negate its effects until the end of the next turn, which could be chained to any hand trap that would be discarded or tributed to use its effect, like all of the Ghost Girls. This would instantly see meta play to counter out both Ash Blossom and the other hand traps, although ironically could be stopped by Ghost Belle if the opponent had it. There are only a couple of hand traps that this didn't stop, such as Gamma, as it never gets sent to grave on activation, and the newly released Imperm, although an answer for that was also released in the same set with Red Reboot, which could be activated from hand, negates the Imperm, and resets it to the field, shutting off traps for the rest of the turn. Although it was rarely played for Imperm specifically, Red Reboot had the incidental benefit of shutting down an Imperm when played to stop a trap-heavy deck in the meta, which were prevalent with the popularity of Guru. After these releases, many older hand traps, particularly in Droll Lockbird and DD Crow, would begin popping up in decks here and there as solid counter options, as hand traps had become so popular in the meta that these once looked over cards had found new life in the meta. Eventually, we would receive a new meta-warping hand trap in the 2019 Gold Sarcophagus 10, being Nibiru the Primal Being, a 3000 attack rock that can be special summoned to your field by tributing all monsters on the field after the opponent summons 5 times in the same turn, giving them a token with stats equal to the tributed monsters in total. Nibiru was recognized immediately as one of the best hand traps in a long time for a couple of reasons. One, it didn't hit the grave on activation, meaning it didn't get countered out by Called By. 2, it made decks play around it just by existing in the format, meaning meta decks had to either set up their boards with 4 or less summons, or they needed to have some way to stop Nibiru on board by summon number 5. A lot of the hand traps mentioned had a similar effect all around. They forced the opponent to play differently, as if you do have the hand trap, their entire play could get shut down. The final card here worth mentioning is Crossout Designator, released in the 2021 10 of Ancient Battles, being the most recent card specifically designed for stopping hand traps. With it, you can banish a card from your deck to negate all cards with that name for a turn, meaning it could be chained to the activated hand trap similar to Called By, only this time it could stop hand traps like Nibiru and Imperm, since it didn't have to rely on its target being in the grave first. While wildly popular in the OCG, the TCG has not quite picked up on using this particular card yet, though it has notably had a few top showings so far. With all of these covered and looking into the future, it is interesting to wonder what the next major hand trap will be, as up until this point, we've received around one per year that changes the landscape of the meta. Who knows what the future holds for the TCG, but whatever it might be, hand traps will definitely be a part of it. Thank you all for watching this deep dive analysis. I do greatly appreciate you guys watching to the very end of this video. If you enjoy content like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more like it. If you want more details on the behind the scenes for these, please follow me on Twitter or check out my Twitch streams whenever they happen. Both links are in the description below. Thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.